Hi guys, this is Mrs. Foy, and this is the screencast on capillary action. Here we have a picture of a capillary, and just to put things in perspective, the blood vessels that are coming from the heart are arteries. Arteries branch into smaller blood vessels called arterioles, and then those branch into the smallest blood vessels that we call capillaries. Capillaries are going to be the very thinnest walled blood vessels that we have. And one of the things that I think students forget sometimes when they think about a capillary is we think of a capillary as like a pipe or something. It's not. It is actually made of cells. And these cells are very thin cells called endothelial cells. They look like little pancakes, but they are actually cells. They have a nucleus, they have organelles. There is another tissue that lines the capillary called the basal lamina, but these are very, very thin, and it makes sense because the whole purpose of capillaries is we want things to get in and out of them, right? So they're carrying things in the blood that we want to get to the tissues, or the alveoli that are right next to them, or vice versa. So let's take a look at what a capillary actually, or what a capillary is actually carrying, right? So one of the things that we need to remember when we are talking about capillaries is that there is a bunch of blood that is going to be in the blood vessel, but there's also going to be things that the blood is carrying. So remember, blood is tissue. Blood is tissue, and blood is going to be made of cells. It's a liquid tissue. It is a liquid tissue. And blood is going to be made of cells that we also called formed elements. Blood also has in it plasma. So we have the liquid portion of the blood, and in the liquid portion of the blood, we've got a bunch of different things. So we have electrolytes, which are basically dissolved ions that can carry an electrical charge. We have organic nutrients, things like fats and glucose and proteins and cholesterol. We have organic waste products that the cell builds up as it's running through its metabolism. And then we've also got some proteins. So we have some proteins that are hormones. We have some little smaller proteins that we call peptides. And so we have all of these things in the blood, and there's a big size difference in the size of some of these things that are in the blood. So one of the things that you need to remember is that a nanogram is a much smaller unit than a micrometer. I'm sorry, a nanometer is a much smaller unit than a micrometer. And there's actually 1,000 nanometers in a micrometer, or a micron is a micrometer. So cells are anywhere from 7.5 to 50 micrometers, and molecules down at the molecule level are maybe 1 nanometer to 10 nanometers. So keep that in mind when we talk about what has to get in and get out. Okay, so one of the things that we need to remember is we have these endothelial cells that are making up the walls of the capillary, right? And of course we have the lumen, that means the inside of the capillary, and capillaries are so small that a red blood cell can basically only fit through one at a time. But there are little tiny gaps. So if you look over here, you will see that there's little tiny gaps between these endothelial cells. So this is a cross section that I'm looking at now. And here are the endothelial cells that I'm looking at from this orientation. I have fluid on the outside of my capillary, and then my cells would be over here. So maybe this is my cell. So interstitial literally means between cells. And so we have this fluid, mostly water, that is in between the capillary and the cells. So keep that in mind, that interstitial fluid. So one of the things that I want to point out is that there's a little tiny gap between these endothelial cells that actually line, that make up the wall of the capillary. And so this gap is about 1 nanometer, right? So there are some things that can actually get through there, like water molecules and some really small ions. And remember that this is going to be lipid, right? So because there's a membrane that's all around that endothelial cells. And so remember, like dissolves like. So if we have things that are lipid soluble, they're going to be more likely to go through here. And certainly things like gases, which are very, very small, are going to be able to pass through these very thin endothelial cells. Ions are charged, so they're going to have to go through these little pores with the water. But then we're going to have some other ways of getting in some bigger things like proteins and peptides. So let's take a little bit closer look at how things get in and out of the capillaries. So remember that if I am coming in this direction, I am coming from the arteries and then arterioles. I'm going to branch into arterioles until I get to this is the actual capillary. And then these capillaries fuse together eventually to form small vessels that we call venules, and they are going to fuse into bigger blood vessels called veins that go back to the heart. But we know that the arterial side is going to be the high pressure, right? Because this is coming directly from the left ventricle when it contracts. And so the blood that is coming through on the arterial side of the capillary is going to be higher pressure. And we call that pressure that's actually being pumped through the vessel the hydrostatic pressure. Okay, so we've got this pressure that's moving through here, and what happens is that as it's moving through, it's going to be, this is just something called fluid dynamics. So what's going to happen is that it's going to force the fluids in a direction that would go out of the capillary. So that's the hydrostatic pressure. That comes from the driving pressure of the blood pressure that comes from the left ventricle. And even though it's very low in the capillary, it is still going to be a net out. Then at the same time, don't forget what we have, osmosis. So remember, osmosis is the diffusion of water in an attempt to dilute the more concentrated side. So water is always going to try to dilute where there is more solute, right? So water, remember, we have this interstitial fluid that is out here in between the cells, and we have some particles in here, right? So we have some proteins, and we have some peptides, and some glucose molecules. And so what's going to happen is water is going to attempt to move into the capillary to diffuse this more concentrated side. So we are going to have two opposing forces in the capillaries. We're going to have hydrostatic pressure that's going to be trying to get things out of the capillary. We have osmotic pressure, which is the force of water from the interstitial fluid trying to move in. And so we have to see which one of those is greater to see where things are going to more likely move in or out. So the net, that means the overall net, like taking everything into consideration, the net pressure on fluids at the arterial side of the capillary is going to be out, because the hydrostatic pressure is greater, because the blood pressure is a little bit greater on the arterial side of the capillary. But by the time you get to the other side of the capillary, at the end of the capillary, right before it turns to the venous side, that net pressure is going to be a lot less going in, because the hydrostatic pressure has decreased, right? So the hydrostatic pressure that is based on the pressure of the blood, this is very, very low now. This pressure is very low, and so the net pressure on the fluids is going to be very weak here. It's actually going to be mostly the hydrostatic pressure. Excuse me, I misspoke. It's going to be mostly the osmotic pressure that happens there, because the hydrostatic pressure is going to get weaker and weaker because of the pressure on the blood. So this is really important, all right? So this is important. So here we have our tissue cells, right? And these tissue cells are going to need things like oxygen, and they're going to need things like glucose. And so here I've got the arterial end. Here I've got the arterial end of my blood coming in here, and here I've got the venous end of my capillary, but this whole thing is the capillary. I've got my interstitial fluid, and I've got my epithelial cells, these endothelial cells that line the actual, make the wall of the capillary. And so what's going to happen is on the arterial end of the capillary, all right, on the arterial end of the capillary, the net fluid movement is out. But by the time we get to the other end of the capillary, the blood pressure is basically dropped off to nothing, so the hydrostatic pressure is going to be very low, and we have more osmotic pressure taking over here, and so my net fluid movement is mostly going to be in. All right, so keep that in mind as we look at the next slide. So guys, there's basically two places in the body that the capillary is going to be exchanging things in and out. And one of those is going to be the alveolus. These are the little air sacs that are in the lungs, the little air sacs that are in the lungs. And the other place that the capillaries are going to be doing their exchange things are in the body cells. Sometimes we call this the somatic cells, the body cells of the body. So basically what's happening here is going to be the exact opposite thing as far as gases goes. So what's going to happen in the lungs? So here's a capillary, right? Here's a capillary that is coming, it's actually going to be coming from the heart this way. So it's coming from the right side of the heart. And what is going to happen as it flows past the air sacs, the alveoli, alveoli is plural for alveolus. What's going to happen is carbon dioxide is going to flow into the alveoli, and oxygen is going to flow into the capillary. So now we have oxygenated blood, and this is going to go back to the heart. It's going to go back to the left side of the heart. And then we have the opposite situation with those gases that are happening in the cell. So here I've got the capillary that is coming now from the heart, so it's coming this way, and it's got high oxygen, and we call these things partial pressures. It's basically a way of measuring the amount of gas that is dissolved in the blood. We call it a partial pressure. So we have a greater partial pressure of oxygen, a greater amount of oxygen in the capillary going to the blood cell, or to the body cells, and so the oxygen is going to fuse into the body cell, and then the CO2 is building up because the mitochondria is going to be burning. It's going to burn glucose, right? It's a little engine that's going to burn glucose. Glucose is the fuel, and it is going to produce some ATPs. And we know that anytime you burn a fuel, you are going to produce carbon dioxide and water in a combustion reaction. And so the CO2 is going to build up, and that needs to diffuse back into the capillary, and then the capillary is going to go back to the heart, to the superior, and eventually the inferior vena cava. So let's take another look at just what's happening in the alveolus. All right, so here we have our capillary coming from the right ventricle. It's coming from the right ventricle, and it's going to come from the pulmonary artery, but it is deoxygenated blood. It's going to get into smaller and smaller, so you would have arterioles and then capillaries. And so now this deoxygenated blood is going to come through, and what's going to happen is that oxygen is going to flow into the capillary, and carbon dioxide is going to flow out. Now, some of the carbon dioxide is actually going to be bound to these bicarbonate ions that are in the blood, and sometimes the carbon dioxide just dissolves in the actual blood fluid itself. And the CO2, and the oxygen we know binds to hemoglobin in the red blood cells, and that's what's going to transport it. So that's what's happening in capillary action in the lung, and what's happening in the body tissues is going to be the opposite thing. So let's orient ourselves. So here we've got blood coming from the arteriole, and it's going to branch into these capillaries. So now I have a capillary bed. Here are my cells. And so the capillary is going to deliver its cargo to those cells. What's it going to deliver? Well, it needs oxygen. The cells need oxygen because they need oxygen to be able to burn the glucose. And they also need amino acids for their metabolism, fatty acids, vitamins, and iron. And at the same time, so those things are going to diffuse into the cells through those different ways that we talked about through the walls of the capillary. And at the same time, the waste products, carbon dioxide, any unwanted metabolites like urea, which is what happens when you break down proteins, and any excess ions need to get out into the capillary. So they're going to go from the cells into the capillary. And all this time, remember, we've got water, we've got that interstitial fluid that is also involved, and some of that water is going to actually leak out of the capillaries, and that needs to be picked up kind of by the body sewer system, which is the lymphatic system. So we have these other vessels that we call lymphatic vessels that are going to pick up water, and it's basically going to take that water and kind of filter the water, if you were, through the lymph vessels and make sure there's no bad pathogens in there, and then it eventually will go back into, it will be recycled back into our circulatory system. So just to review about the different pathways that you can get things in and out, we have diffusion, and you know diffusion is the movement of high concentration to low through a semi-permeable membrane. So if it is uncharged, or if the size is the right size, if it's small enough, it can get through if it's high to low. If we, and we can also have facilitated diffusion, which is also from high to low, but we have a carrier in the membrane that can make it go faster, but that's still passive because it's from high to low transport. Then we also have a way of moving things from low to high, and this is where we use those proteins that are embedded in the cell membrane, and this would be active transport, and that's another way that we can get materials in and out of the capillary and into the cells. And then, of course, the really big things we can move in through endo and exocytosis. So that is another way that cells can transport things in and out. So hopefully this has been helpful to you, and I will see you in class. But the one thing I want to leave you with is, don't forget about osmotic pressure. Osmotic pressure is the movement of water. So here I have a situation where I have some water molecules on both sides of a semi-permeable membrane, but these sucrose molecules over here, these big green things, can't get through. Otherwise they would move from this side over here to this side. They would move to the left, but they can't because they're too big. And so water is going to then attempt to move in this direction to attempt to dilute the more concentrated side, and that is osmotic pressure, and that is also involved in capillaries. So hopefully that's been helpful, and I will see you in class.